Hello everybody, this is Philipp Jonas for Kalamazoo Valley Community College, and today we're going to discuss aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So let's have a look at how our economy behaves over the long run. We see about 3% per year growth on average, but there are fluctuations around that trend. If they are in the negative direction, falling incomes, rising unemployment, we refer to them as a recession. And if that recession is particularly severe, it's referred to as a depression. Let's have a look at how these business cycles behave in terms of three basic data facts. By the way, the term business cycle might lead you to suspect that this phenomenon is cyclical, as in predictable. But our first fact is that is not how business cycles behave. They are irregular and unpredictable. Here you're looking at a few decades worth of macroeconomic data for the United States. Real GDP, so the effect of inflation is already taken out of it in the blue line. And then the yellow bars show the official recessions of the United States. You see that some are long, some are short. Sometimes recessions follow each other. Sometimes we see many, many years without a recession. And if you were to only look at this blue line of real GDP as a whole, without those yellow bars, it might even be difficult to pick out when the recessions happen. In terms of overall real GDP, it seems like it's a rather mild phenomenon. But in fact, recessions can cause a lot of suffering. Because when our economy goes through a business cycle, there are many data series in our economy that fluctuate together with this recession, and often much more severely than the overall economic output. So here, for example, is for the same time period investment spending in the United States. Since investment spending, by definition, depends on the value that we place on the future, on the expectations we have, you see it declining much more greatly in percentage terms than GDP as a whole during a recession. Particularly look at 2008, 2009 here, a recession that was very much centered on the housing market, housing construction, of course, being a component of investment spending in our economy. And then perhaps the most important fact about recessions. When recessions strike our economy, the unemployment rate spikes. And that, of course, causes a lot of suffering. It's not during a recession that all of us lose a little bit of our income, but rather some of us lose most or all of our income. And that is where we really see the call to action that macroeconomic policies that are designed to make recessions shorter and less severe can really make a positive difference. For the remaining lectures in our course, we are going to learn about the basic model we use to make sense of that. How do recessions happen? That'll be our focus in this lecture. And then in coming lectures, what tools does the government have available to try to make these recessions shorter and less severe? This tool is referred to as Aggregate-Demand and Aggregate-Supply, the title of today's lecture, and it will overturn, in a way, some of the basics of classical economics we've learned so far in this course. So, mini recap. Classical economics, roughly speaking, macroeconomics as we thought about it in the 19th century and before. We've got some really big ideas in there we've learned about. Number one, the classical dichotomy. when we look at macroeconomic data, we should really cleanly divide between that data which is real, measured in physical quantities, and that data which is nominal, measured in monetary units. And one of the reasons that this distinction, this dichotomy is so important is of course that in classical economics, money is neutral, which means when the central bank engages in monetary policy, so it changes how many units of money exist, this will only affect nominal variables. It'll have no effect on real variables. So this is something that we are going to relax in modern macroeconomics, at least for the short run during a business cycle. As we will learn, in the short run, monetary policy can in fact affect real variables. Money is not strictly neutral. We'll get to that towards the end of this lecture. Let's start out with having me introduce you to the setup of the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So as you can guess from the name, this model is of the class of supply and demand. So as always, we're going to have the value or price of something on the y-axis and some sort of quantity variable on the x-axis. The reason it's referred to as an aggregate model is that it's not the supply or demand of one specific product in our economy, but rather of all economic production aggregated for our entire economic system. So when, for example, we look at the y-axis for that price, we see the price level of all things in our economy. We've learned some measures for that, for example, consumer price index and the GDP deflator. And then likewise on the x-axis, we have the quantity of all production in our economy. One of the very first things we learned in this course, real GDP, is how we measure that. That's why on that y-axis, we're not seeing the symbol Q, but rather the Y, our symbol for real GDP. So this model of aggregate supply and demand, it does tick by some rules that are a little bit different from an individual supply and demand model. But if you look at the big picture, it looks like an ordinary supply and demand model. So let's start with our aggregate demand curve, downward sloping, just like you're used to from ordinary demand curves. Let's look at our aggregate supply curve, or to be slightly more precise, the short run aggregate supply curve. I'll tell you what that means in a bit. Standard upward sloping curve. But since these supply and demand curves reflect the aggregation of all supply and demand in our economy, they do operate for slightly different reasons. Just to give a first example, if you look at the demand for an individual product, when the price of that product increases, one of the reasons that people buy less is that they buy more of other products. We call that substitution in economics. For an aggregate demand curve, though, we're talking about when the price level rises, consumers are buying less of all products. So that's not a substitution effect. In spite of the fact that we have these different underlying reasons for aggregate supply and demand, it still works by producing an equilibrium for our entire economy. So here on the y-axis, we've got the equilibrium price level, and down on the x-axis, we've got the equilibrium output level, real GDP. And just like with individual supply and demand curves, we're going to look at events that shift these curves and how they affect our economy as a whole. So this is what this is going to look like once it's all put together. Now, let's learn about the pieces. Let's start with the aggregate demand curve. One more time. The aggregate demand curve represents the aggregated demand, the quantity of goods and services of everything that can be bought in our economy at any given price level. It is downward sloping, meaning if the price level were to rise, like here from P1 to P2, This is associated with fewer goods and services being demanded by our consumers. But that's not the substitution effect at work. There's something else going on when we look at an aggregate demand curve. So let's talk about that. Another way to talk about aggregate demand is to go back to our national income accounting identity, one of the first things we learned in this course. So here on the right-hand side of the equal sign, we have C, I, G, and NX, spending on consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports for our entire economy. This is what the aggregate demand curve represents, those four major categories of spending. And we're now going to talk about how they change. Let's start with the one that doesn't change inside this model. Government spending. When we learn the methods that are available to fight recessions, one of them will be to vary government spending. We call that a policy variable. So for example, if our economy is in a recession because there's insufficient spending in other categories, one possible way to combat that recession is to increase government purchases. So that's going to be one of the levers we can pull to influence our economy. The aggregate demand curve describes how the other three components of spending in our economy, C, I, and NX, how those three change when there is a change in the price level. Just like with the substitution effect for individual demand curves, each of these changes in spending will be referred to as an effect. So there's three types of changes in spending. We're going to be talking about three effects here. Let's start with the effect that changes consumption spending. This one is referred to as the wealth effect. So we want to describe when the price level in our economy rises, why does consumption spending decrease? The underlying reason, the connection between the price level and consumption, is wealth. When the price level in our economy rises, the existing wealth of our consumers, their net worth, if you will, it doesn't increase automatically just because the price level rises. So if you have a fixed nominal wealth and the price level goes up, that means this wealth can now buy fewer goods and services. In real terms, consumers' wealth falls when the price level rises. This makes consumers feel poorer, and as a consequence, they decrease consumption. This is the first reason why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward. A pretty straightforward one. A rising price level lowers real wealth. Let's get to number two. The reason that investment spending decreases when the price level rises. This one is referred to as the interest rate effect. And it's going to be very important for the remainder of our course. So in our next lecture, we are going to revisit how the interest rate effect works with a supply and demand model. But for today, let me just give you a narrative introduction. When the price level in our economy rises, there is an impact on money demand. This is a concept we learned about a few lectures ago. The idea that out of all the wealth that consumers hold, how much of it do they want to hold in monetary units? When the price level rises, buying the goods and services you want to buy requires more units of money. So that means there's an increase in money demand. So for a given amount of wealth, if you want to increase how much of that wealth you hold in the form of money, that means you must decrease the other assets that you may hold your wealth in, such as bonds, for example, or stocks. A rising price level causes consumers to increase their holdings of money and decrease their holdings of bonds and other financial assets. This increases interest rates. When consumers are selling off bonds in financial markets, that makes those bonds have to pay a higher interest rate to attract purchasers, or if you want to be even more precise about it from a net present value standpoint, when consumers sell off bonds, the price of bonds falls. The lower the price of a bond, the higher its yield. As we learned in our lecture on our financial system, investment spending in our economy is sensitive to changes in interest rates. The higher price level leads to a higher interest rate. This will lower investment spending. And that's the interest rate effect. A higher price level leads to lower investment spending. Finally, let's get to the exchange rate effect. This one explains why a higher price level leads to lower net exports. So with the interest rate effect, we've already learned that a higher price level leads to higher interest rates. That's the starting point of the exchange rate effect. And now we have a look at how this affects the value of our domestic currency. Think of it this way. There's a global pool of capital that chases a nice rate of return. If interest rates go up in any given country, foreign investors are attracted to this country. There's now a better rate of return on those bonds. So foreign investors start buying those bonds, but of course in order to buy the domestic bonds, they need to buy the domestic currency. When interest rates in a country rise, this increases the demand for that country's currency. Asterisk, we learned in the previous lecture that in cases of capital flight, that's not true. Investment might leave a country because it's worried about political stability or something else that'll make it lose its principle. But assuming the country is stable, higher interest rates will attract foreign money to buy bonds denominated in that currency. So what's that going to do to the value of that currency? It'll appreciate. The more foreigners are buying, in this example, US dollars, the more US dollars will become worth. And as we have learned, if a local currency gains in value, that lowers exports, its products are now more expensive to the rest of the world, and it increases imports. Imports become a better deal. The appreciation of the local currency will decrease net exports. This is the reason why a higher price level leads to a country having lower net exports. We've now learned about the three effects that give us the slope of the aggregate demand curve. Let's go ahead and put these together and look at the aggregate demand curve as a whole one more time. Starting at P1 and Y1. If the price level in an economy rises, purchases of goods and services decrease across the economy for three reasons. Number one, consumption will decrease because of the wealth effect. Number two, investment spending will decrease because of the interest rate effect. And number three, net exports will decrease because of the exchange rate effect. Together, these three changes in purchases give us a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So you can see this is a little bit different from microeconomics and an individual demand curve. That being said, we're still going to use it like we're used to demand curves. We're going to look at events that shift the position of the curve itself, Right now we're looking at a movement up and down that aggregate demand curve, a movement caused by a change in the price level. But we're going to look at events that shift the entire curve and see what they do to the equilibrium of our economy. So what could that be? Well, it's anything that changes purchases in our economy that's not a change in the price level. A change in the price level moves us up and down an existing aggregate demand curve. Anything else that changes consumption, investment spending, government purchases, or net exports in our economy moves the curve as a whole. So that can be a lot of reasons. Let me just mention one to you. Let's say, for example, that we have a stock market boom. Well, if stocks gain value, that's going to make consumers feel wealthier. So they will increase consumption spending. This would be a shift of the aggregate demand curve because we're seeing an increase in consumption spending for a reason other than a change in the price level. Likewise, if something decreases spending in our economy, that aggregate demand curve would shift to the left. I'll have an example of that later on today. But first, it's time for us to learn about the aggregate supply curve. Or to be slightly more precise, the aggregate supply curves. This model, the model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, has two supply curves in it. Let me tell you what that's all about. So a little bit earlier today, I showed you a supply curve like you're used to, upward sloping. This is the so-called short-run aggregate supply curve, and it describes how our economy behaves during a business cycle in the so-called short run. But there is a second aggregate supply curve, the so-called long-run aggregate supply curve, and that one is vertical. Let's go ahead and learn about that vertical long-run aggregate supply curve first. So what this represents is that in the long run, there is a level of real GDP down here, where the long-run aggregate supply curve meets the x-axis. This level of real GDP is referred to as the natural rate of output of our economy. It can also be referred to as the potential output of our economy or our economy's full employment output. This is the point to which our economy returns if you look beyond a given business cycle. Now, a vertical supply curve, of course, means that when we have a change on the y-axis, let's say the price level increases, there is no change on the x-axis. In other words, an increase or decrease in the price level of our economy does not change our economy's natural rate of output. This is classical economics. This is the classical dichotomy. When the price level changes, the price level being a nominal variable, there is no change on the real variable down here, our rate of real GDP. In the long run, this classical dichotomy is a good description for our economy. But we're going to amend it. That's what that second supply curve is going to be all about. Now, of course, just because classical economics says that when we've got, for example, a change in monetary policy, there's no impact on real variables, such as real GDP down here. There are, of course, real changes in our economy that can change real GDP. We would represent these as a shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve itself. And fundamentally, we learned in our lecture on long-run economic growth what increases our economy's ability to produce goods and services in the long run. Let me just give one possible example here. Let's say we've got a big increase in our labor force. Like, for example, let's say we managed to attract a lot of skilled immigrants into our country. This would increase our economy's ability to produce goods and services. And in classical, just like in modern macroeconomics, we would represent that by shifting the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. So one way to look at classical economics is to draw an aggregate supply and aggregate demand model where the aggregate supply curve is vertical. Let's have a look at how this can describe economic growth and inflation over the long run. Number one, over the long run, aggregate supply in our economy increases. It does that for a number of reasons, but for a well-developed country like the United States, the number one reason for increases in long-run aggregate supply are increases in technology. So let's go ahead and simulate a few decades of technological progress here, shifting the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. Number two, over the decades, monetary policy, increases in the money supply, shift aggregate demand to the right. And in fact, we conduct monetary policy in such a way that it shifts aggregate demand by a little bit more than long-run aggregate supply increases by. So if we put both of these long-run phenomena together, from blue to the red curves to the yellow curves, let's see how the long-run equilibrium of our economy changes. Over the decades, down here on the x-axis, we see real GDP increasing. That's what we call economic growth. And on the y-axis, we see the price level increasing. That's what we call inflation. Let's do it again from red to yellow. Real GDP increases and the price level increases. Growth and inflation. So you can see for the long run, this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply is completely compatible with what we've learned in this course so far. It's a little overkill to draw it this way. We had already learned about the phenomena of growth and inflation in the long run when we learned about our model of long-run economic growth and about the quantity theory of money to explain inflation. But again, everything fits together. So now comes the new part, where modern macroeconomics adds something that classical economics didn't have. A description of how our economy displays those business cycles in the short run. And that's based on an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. So if we look first of all at that upward slope, what that means is when the price level in our economy increases, in the short run, there is an impact on production. Increasing price level, increasing production of goods and services. We'll get to what short run means specifically in just a little bit. For now, think of it as a year or two, just to give you an idea. Now this right here is in contrast to classical economics. If you showed this to a classical economist, they would say this is total nonsense. A nominal variable like the price level shouldn't lead to changes in real GDP. But this is needed to make sense of how business cycles behave. Let me show you why. So what you're looking at right now is classical economics only. We've got an aggregate demand curve, and then we only have that vertical aggregate supply curve. Now let's play out two types of events. Number one, an economic boom. Let's say we've got, for example, a big boom in the stock market, that moves aggregate demand to the right and spending increases. In classical economics, this would raise the price level in our economy, give us more inflation, but it would have no impact whatsoever on output or employment. Our economy would just stay at that natural rate of output. That's not what economic booms look like. In real life, economic booms have more economic output and falls in the unemployment rate. They have increases in employment. Likewise, let's look at a recession. Aggregate demand shifting to the left. Let's say there's a crash in the housing market, making people feel poorer, so they cut back on spending. In classical economics, this would be cleared right up by a fall in the price level of our economy. Again, no change in output, no change in the unemployment rate. Again, that does not match our experience with the real world. So let's go ahead and extend this model now to modern macroeconomics. Modern macroeconomics has that vertical long-run aggregate supply curve, but also an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. It shows how our economy reacts for a while during a business cycle. So again, let's start in the middle here, intersection of all three lines, and simulate an economic boom. Aggregate demand shifts to the right, to the green line. In the short run, modern macroeconomics predicts that the price level in our economy rises and, crucially, that there is an impact on the real side of our economy. We see more output, more production, therefore more employment, a lower unemployment rate. That checks out. That's how the real world works. Conversely, let's simulate the recession, starting at the middle here, moving aggregate demand to the left, doing the red shift. In the short run, modern macroeconomics predicts a falling price level and a decrease in real GDP, a decrease in output, which of course means we're going to have a rising unemployment rate. That too matches our experience with the real world. So we know we're going to need that short-run aggregate supply curve to make sense of the business cycle. But why does it behave this way? It seems to not match what we've learned about our economy so far. Well, this is where modern macroeconomics has contributed to our understanding of our economy in the short run. There are three leading theories of why our economy's output responds to changes in aggregate demand for at least a while. All three of them have a similar core. They basically describe that when there's an unexpected change in aggregate demand, some part of our economic system has trouble adapting to this unexpected change. We call that a market imperfection. Not an outright market failure, but the market doesn't work as well as you would want it to. And this leads to output temporarily moving away from the natural rate. And that surprise element is really important. So let me walk you through these three leading theories of the short-run aggregate supply curve. Number one, the sticky wage theory. This one holds that the market imperfection that gives us business cycles is centered on the labor market. That the labor market is bad at adapting to surprises. It will adapt, but slowly. Anytime we have a variable like that in economics, a variable that changes, but slowly, we refer to it as being sticky. So the sticky wage theory says the imperfection in the labor market is that wages are sticky. For a variety of reasons that we could cite, wages do not change nearly as fast as other prices in our economy. For example, think about how often the price of gas at the gas station changes. That's a very fast changing price. Couple of times, possibly every day. Think about how often the wage you earn at your job changes. Maybe once or twice a year, much slower. It's sticky. So what that means is, if price levels come in different than what was expected, wages are now a little out of step with the rest of our economy, and they take a while to catch up. For example, let's say the price level in our economy comes in greater than expected. See that subscript E on the price level variable here? We put that subscript E on a variable when we mean here's what people thought was going to happen, what was expected, as opposed to the actual number. So if price level comes in higher than expected, firms are earning more revenue from those higher prices, but wages aren't going up right away. So for a while there, those firms are earning more profit and are increasing output and employment to capture that opportunity. This would be one way to explain how our economy reacts to unexpected changes in the price level. Number 2, the sticky price theory. So it's a very similar idea here. Again, something in our economy is sticky, slow to change. But in this one, it isn't wages specifically, but the prices of some businesses. The idea is that not all businesses are like the gas station that can change the price of its product very quickly. Some businesses are stuck changing their prices only every once in a while because the act of changing prices itself is costly for them. This is referred to as menu cost, when changing prices is difficult or otherwise expensive. So what happens here, when the price level comes in different than expected, for a while, firms are stuck, if you will, at the wrong price level. If the price level is higher than expected, these firms would like to raise their prices to that higher price level. They can't do it right away. So they do the next best thing. Being stuck with inefficiently low prices, they instead increase output and employment. Likewise, if prices come in lower than expected, these firms can't cut prices very easily. They are stuck with prices that are too high for a while. This leads to decreases in output and employment. Again, a market imperfection explains how a change in the price level that was unexpected will lead to a change in real output. And then we have one more. This one isn't based on stickiness, but a somewhat similar concept. Let's say firms can change their prices at will, but when the price level in our economy comes in different than expected, they don't right away realize that changing their prices is in order. Instead, they might confuse a change in the overall price level with a change in the demand for their specific product. For example, if the price level comes in higher than expected, even though this is the price level across the entire economy, some firms, they misperceive this signal and they think, oh, my specific product is in a boom. I should go ahead and raise output and increase employment. Again, an unexpected change in the price level ends up having a real impact. Chances are the slope of the short-run aggregate supply curve is affected by all three of these theories. although we're not quite certain yet how relatively important they are to each other. However, if we abstract away from the specific mechanism, all three theories predict the same behavior in our economy when it comes to output. And let me start out by showing you an equation that summarizes this nicely. It looks a little intimidating when you first look at it, but it actually makes a very simple statement. In modern macroeconomics, real GDP, that's the capital Y here, isn't simply always equal to the natural rate of GDP. It is in the long run, but not necessarily in the short run. In modern macroeconomics, actual output can be different from the natural rate of output. And that is governed by the second term. Output in our economy moves away from the natural rate anytime the price level in our economy is different from what was expected. That's the key to all three theories. When the price level is a different number than the expected price level, we have a term in the parentheses here, and this term knocks our actual level of output away from the natural level by some degree. This degree here is represented using the lowercase a. And if we were having a lecture about econometrics, we might talk about the size of this impact. But for our purposes in principles of macroeconomics, let's just say it's a number greater than 0 that describes how much surprises affect our economy. Let me show you how this directly ties back to the two aggregate supply curves in our economy. We have an aggregate supply curve in the short run that's upward sloping. We have a second aggregate supply curve that's vertical at the natural rate of output of our economy. And now we know the difference between these two curves. When our economy's price level is equal to the expected price level, this entire term behind the plus sign becomes 0. That's when our economy's output is at the natural rate. That's when our economy is in the long run. But in the short run, if the price level is different from the expected price level, we see an impact on real GDP. Option number 1, what we refer to as a boom or an expansion. If the price level is greater than expected, if P is greater than PE, we see our output rise above the natural rate. So that's us traveling up on that short-run aggregate supply curve. Option number 2, if the price level comes in lower than expected, P minus PE becomes a negative number, our economy's output will fall below the natural rate. This is a movement down along the short-run aggregate supply curve. And our economy doesn't return to its natural rate until the price level and the expected price level are back to being the same number. So in other words, the perhaps best way to think about the short-run aggregate supply curve is that it reflects that amount of time in our economy where expectations about our price level have not yet caught up with reality, where our economy is still adjusting. Now let's go ahead and finish up with some practical examples here. In a second, I'm going to add the aggregate demand curve back into our model. Let me remind you, We start out with our economy being in the long run. The long run happens when the price level is equal to the expected price level, which also means that real GDP is equal to the natural rate of output. So the starting point of our economy is all three curves are intersecting at the same point. In this long run equilibrium, expectations are in line with reality, GDP is at its natural rate of output, and this means that the unemployment rate is also at its natural rate. And now we're going to simulate what happens, for example, if aggregate demand shifts. This is how most business cycles get started, with a shift in the aggregate demand curve. Earlier today, we talked about a stock market boom shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right. Now let's do a recession story. A stock market crash makes consumers feel poorer, so they spend less money. Let's go ahead and shift the aggregate demand curve to the left to reflect the impact of this. The model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply is effectively a two-speed model. The first thing you look for is the short-run equilibrium. So look at the intersection of aggregate demand and the short-run aggregate supply curve. We predict that the effect of the stock market crash will be a fall in the price level and a decrease in real GDP. That's the movement from A to B. That's the short run. In our next lecture, we will talk about how the government can perhaps adopt policies to push back against this recession. But for today, let's just talk about how this model describes what our economy would do by itself. In the short run, the price level falls, real GDP falls, and that means unemployment spikes up. And then eventually, classical economics is right and our economy returns to the long run. So that's going to be the intersection of aggregate demand and the long run aggregate supply curve. When exactly does that happen? Once the expected price level has adjusted to match the actual price level again. The expected price level, that's what gives us the position of the short-run aggregate supply curve. So the expected price level has to fall enough to meet the actual price level. That's what moves us from B to C. We see an even greater fall in prices and our economy return to its natural rate of output. In other words, recessions do end. The problem is, if we wait for our economy to recover by itself, this recession can be deep and lengthy. Let me show you an example of a particularly deep recession, the Great Depression of 1929. So the Great Depression actually had a number of causes, but let's simplify a little bit. Let's just say there was a big decrease in aggregate demand because of the money supply falling, because there was a widespread banking crisis, and also there was a big crash in the stock market, and we'll just leave it at that for decreases in aggregate demand. So consumption decreases, investment spending decreases, aggregate demand shifts to the left. Our model predicts the price level will fall, output will fall. But look at the size of these effects. During the Great Depression, real GDP fell by over a quarter. Over a quarter of economic output was lost, which means we not only had deflation, falling prices, but also an unemployment rate that spiked to 25%. And that Great Depression lingered for years, as you can see, with that decrease in real GDP just year after year after year. If we simply wait for this to end by itself, there will be a lot of suffering. Conversely, let's look at a big increase in aggregate demand that happened just a few years later. World War II led to a tremendous increase in government spending. Government spending went up tenfold in the span of just a few years. So this increase in aggregate demand, our model would predict that the price level rises and real GDP rises. Let's see what happened here. Real GDP almost doubled over this time period, and we see the price level increasing by 20%. And there were price controls in effect during World War II, so if we hadn't had those, maybe we would have seen an even bigger change in the price level. The point is, the modern model of macroeconomics, the one that has that short-run aggregate supply curve, is quite effective at giving us qualitative ideas about how changes in aggregate demand impact our economy in the short run. Now, these are the most common types of recessions and expansions, shifts in aggregate demand. We will, however, in the rest of our course, also touch on another type of recession, a supply shock, a supply-side recession. A famous example here in the case of the United States is an increase in oil prices that happened during the 1970s. Let me give you a preview of what this will look like and why this type of recession is particularly difficult for an economy to handle. A supply-side recession shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. Arguably, it also shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve, but for the sake of simplicity, let's say that one stays constant, so that somehow this increase in oil prices, we know it'll end again in short order and our natural rate of output is not affected. Makes it a little bit easier to show how this model works. Now see what happens when the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. Both variables get worse. The price level rises, we get inflation, and we get falling output, meaning a higher unemployment rate. Everything gets worse. Higher inflation, higher unemployment. We call that stagflation. So in this example, as we experience stagflation, let's say our economy returns to normal because the low unemployment causes eventually wages to fall and the expected price level to drop until we're back at our original point. That again can be a very long recovery. Or alternatively, maybe aggregate demand will increase because there's expansionary monetary policy leading us back to the natural rate of output and employment with a higher price level. Both of these endings have some downsides, which is why supply shocks are particularly difficult for economies to digest. But we'll talk about those more in coming lectures, when we will also learn about how the government can fight recessions. For now, this concludes our introduction to the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and how business cycles work in the short run in modern macroeconomics. I will see you next time.